Humanianity, a new religious call. Humanity, religion for us all. Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better we can be.
Hi, I'm Bill Van Fleet, and this is Humanianity Conversation number 99, recorded on January 22nd, 2021. It is the 51st recorded conversation with my friend Mike. We focused on many issues surrounding consciousness and thus increasingly on the mind-body problem and the free will versus determinism problem, which we realize need further discussion. Hi, Mike.
Hey, hi, Bill.
Hi.
All right. So before we begin, we talked about last time reviewing the rules of our discussion, which, as I recall, it's one finger for I disagree with what you're saying, but it's not necessary for you to stop. And then two fingers are, wait a minute, I'm not following what you're saying. You're building conclusion. You're building an argument on something that I don't understand, and you need to stop. That's two fingers. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's move forward with that then. And I think at now that we've reviewed the discussions, the onus is on me because at the end of the last conversation, I was tasked with reviewing my ideas about whether or not consciousness is part of subjective experience. And to just recap what happened at the end of the last discussion, we were exploring how we each define subjective experience. And you had asked me a question, well, is consciousness part of subjective experience? And after a whole bunch of going back and forth and presenting various arguments on the matter, I had made the realization that I was adopting a third person point of view. Basically, I was using my imagination to look at subjective experience and consciousness. And I was using a point of view that I often argue with you never exists in reality. And, when I made that realization, I had to concede it might very well be possible that consciousness is indeed part of subjective experience, as you postulated. Go ahead.
Well, I immediately got lost when you spoke about the third person point of view.
Okay. I need to get better with articulating what that means. What I'm referring to when I use a third person point of view.
But let me also add one thing to that. And I still, for me, it seems that there is no difference between consciousness and subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
They mean exactly the same thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Right. Yeah, and I was aware of that, and the realization that I was using an imaginary third-person view to analyze whether or not consciousness and subjective experience are the same thing was what caused me to pause for a minute. So let me just, before I talk about what I thought about this week regarding this issue, so let's clarify what I mean by third-person point of view in a much more operational manner. To take a third-person point of view is to imagine something from a point of view firstly, it means to use your imagination, and it means to consider a problem from a point of view that is never, ever experienced in the situation you're analyzing. So, for example, when I'm thinking about just whether or not consciousness is part of subjective experience, okay? When I say I'm using a third-person point of view to analyze that problem, I am imagining in my head an entity called subjective experience and an entity called consciousness. And I'm trying to imagine how both of those things interact. So that is a third-person point of view compared to what it's like while I'm actually living. While I'm actually living and talking to you, I am not seeing my consciousness and my subjective experience and considering it. The way I experience my subjective experience and consciousness would be considered from a first-person point of view as I'm speaking to you right now. It is something that I am experiencing. It's happening to me. It is not an imaginary structure. It is not an imagination in my mind that I'm considering something called my subjective experience and something called my consciousness. One would be considered a third-person point of view. The other would be considered a first-person point of view. Does that clarify at all?
A little bit, but there's still a problem. I wonder if you could answer the question, why do you make any distinction between consciousness and subjective experience?
Okay, so let me just go into the whole my presentation for what my conclusion was. So I told you that I would be thinking about this next week, about why I'm making a distinction between consciousness and subjective experience. Now, I thought about it, and even though I agree with what I said at the end of the last discussion, that taking a third-person point of view is not appropriate because it doesn't ever happen. That's not the way subjective experience is actually experienced when one is living. There are other ways to consider whether or not your consciousness is part of subjective experience, and that is to relay and to consider what, in some kind of an accurate way as possible, what my actual subjective experience is here when I'm, like, for example, when I'm talking to you. So I still maintain that consciousness is not part of subjective experience, and here's why. The experience that I have of things that you and I would consider to be part of subjective experience, my motivational states, my emotions, my sensory experience, things like that, is qualitatively different than what I would, or what you and I would call consciousness. I cannot experience, I can say, I don't believe at least, I do not experience my consciousness in the same way that I experience my sensation, my eyesight, my thoughts, my emotions, my motivational states. There is a qualitative difference here that, in my opinion, mandates a different category for consciousness. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I think that I'm seeing where we're deviating. You're talking about what you experience and whether you experience your consciousness. But that's actually a contradiction in terminology, I think, one way of looking at it. What we're talking about is just the use of labels, a word to designate something so we can talk about it. Okay, so
Okay.
I would maintain that in fact, we never experience consciousness. Consciousness is just a word that is supposed to be the container for everything that we experience.
I
And
see.
so,
Okay.
subjective experience is not something that we observe, it is just a label for whatever we're experiencing. And so the two words for me mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So now you keep referring to whether consciousness is in subjective experience. And that would be a misuse of words in my language. Consciousness is not just another item that is floating around in subjective experience,
Okay.
like uh, hunger or a pain or joy or thirst or whatever. So, consciousness and subjective experience are just two terms that mean the same thing. And what they mean is everything uh, that is being experienced, or everything that can, well, everything that is being experienced at any particular point in time.
Okay. So this brings up, I think, this reveals a very, very important difference between what I am considering when I think about consciousness and what you're considering. I am in a sense defending the proposition that consciousness and the sense of self are the same thing. That's how when I think of consciousness and I think of what that word represents, the idea behind it, it's something very, very different than you. This is the real difference that I think that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness, the way I understand the idea, means in other terminology, a sense of self, I, the idea that there is a sense of self that is experiencing things. So in my worldview, there is a sense of self, an I, and the subjective experience of that sense of self.
Okay.
That's where we got confused last time, because you were postulating that sense of self is your subjective experience, and I think
No,
that's where no. So what were you postulating?
no. If we assume that animals, uh, including us humans, have something called consciousness, um, or subjective experience, the sense of self is one of the items that label is referring to. And the sense of self does not develop, as we have talked about, does not develop until there's been a certain amount of interaction out in the world, out from the womb, that where the human or other animal begins to recognize that there are some things that are always experienced, that are always there, and then there are other things that change. And this may not be doing a real good job, probably people who have studied this particular area, the sense of the self, would be more precise about it. But the basic idea is that the sense of self is something that is learned and is not likely to be as complex in non-human animals. I'm not really sure about that last statement. Things are different for us humans because we have created this symbolic language, and so we've got all these words floating around that we're using, and the words themselves have, quote, meaning, which is the basis for poetry and so on. And for later, for technical use, where the meaning of the word becomes more precise. But at any rate, that's going kind of off course. So here's where I think we see things differently. You have a feeling that there is a you that is experiencing things. That feeling is one of your experiences. So it fits into the under the label subjective experience or consciousness, which is the sum total of all those experiences.
When you had said where it's a feeling, I don't know if I would use that word, a feeling. What in my original thesis, my presentation, it was acknowledged that there seems to be something experiencing what we would consider to be entities in subjective experience. And that's just now that I acknowledge 100% that belief could be an artifact of language or an artifact of the subjective experience itself. Like, for example, me having, or the act of experiencing subjective experience, things in subjective experience, presents the illusion like there is a sense of self, there is an I that's experiencing them. I acknowledge that could very well be possible, but until there is some kind of more definitive argument or evidence that claims otherwise in any kind of really convincing or meaningful way, I think it is appropriate to go with what my experience is telling me. I mean, that's what it seems like to me, even though I acknowledge it could be, for lack of a better word, an illusion that's created based on the way subjective experience works. But for practical purposes, certainly there is the impression I have that I am things are happening to me. And that for me, that matters.
But that is part of your consciousness. That feeling.
Okay. If that's the way you're defining consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and I would agree with that. When I was thinking about this, it reminded me of the difference of opinion we had with regards to belief. I had made the argument there that yes, turning the wheel and the car going and thinking having the expectation that the car going left is a belief, in the same way a belief in God is a belief. But I also made the argument that those two beliefs are so qualitatively different that they deserve different categories. And I think the same thing applies here.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, different categories of belief.
I had argued something a little bit that it mandated something a little bit more substantial than just a different category of belief.
Now, let's be more exact here. You say that they are different categories, but different categories of what? And we use the word in both situations. So therefore,
Yes.
According to word usage, beliefs would include the category, however you want to define it, that would include beliefs about what will happen if you turn the steering wheel left, and beliefs about an entity that is watching you and will react certain ways to what you do.
Yes, and that might follow from word usage, but that doesn't follow from a reasoning or an inferential analysis at all, which is why it should not be called. They should not both be called beliefs. And that was my whole thesis before. I don't know if we want to go back to that again.
Well, we need to if we're going to try to work toward agreement or to figure out why we diverge.
Well, what I mean right now, do we want to go back to that right now? Because we're talking about subjective experience and consciousness.
No, we don't have to. If you feel like we need to stay with what we're at, then yes, that's what we should do.
Yeah, I think not to confuse the topic of this discussion, maybe next time we can go back to it. But in a similar way, I would agree. I mean, if consciousness is not part of subjective experience, in a certain point of view, you could infer whether there's some entity called consciousness floating around here, and that starts to speak to ideas of spirit that can leave the body and all that kind of stuff. That's not kind of what I'm saying here. So if you're using the word subjective experience in the way I kind of now understand you're better, I think, how you're using it, I would agree. Just like I said about beliefs, yes, consciousness clearly is part of subjective experience. However, I have an important caveat.
See, again, I do not agree with that.
Okay, so then say it again so I can make sure I got it. Okay, so what is it that you're saying? I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying. I need more. Say it again.
You keep saying consciousness is a part of subjective experience. I keep saying they mean the
same thing. Right. So is it fair for me to say consciousness is subjective experience?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So if you're using it that way, I would agree with using in word usage in that way. Now, I'm going to make an important distinction here that there's a limit to that word usage, that if you start now on the basis of that word usage, that consciousness is subjective experience. I think that you could, on the basis of that similarity between conscious and subjective experience, start arguing ideas and concepts and premises for subjective experience that would apply to consciousness. And for me,
I didn't follow that.
If you consider, well, let me say it a different way. If you're considering consciousness to be identical as to be subjective experience, fine, that's okay. What I'm interested in, what matters in my worldview and my argument here, and my premise, is the sense of self, because that's really that's what I meant when I was considering consciousness and whether or not it was subjective experience or part of subjective experience. So if you let's use it, let's say consciousness is part of is subjective experience. They're the same thing. Okay. What I'm interested in discovering with you is this belief that I have, that I imagine other people have too. Not sure about that. I think most people would say things happen to me. And they say things happen to me not as an artifact of grammar or a sentence structure. They say things happen to me because that's what it seems like. Somebody smacks me across the face. There's an experience of I'm experiencing that feeling. So the salient point that I'm trying to answer, and I was thinking about last time, which I now understand we were almost talking past each other last time because I didn't understand what you meant by consciousness, is that sense of I part of subjective experience or not? That's really important.
If it is subjectively experienced, it is a part of subjective experience. If it is something that is that one is conscious of, then it is a part of consciousness or a part of subjective experience. You're talking about something that is completely removed from the whole idea of what is consciousness and subjective experience.
Correct.
On the other hand, what I think this concern that you have,
more of an verb.
what I think that this concern that you have is related to is the whole thing that we talk about having to do with, well, where does consciousness fit into reality or into not necessarily, let's say, reality, but into what exists. In other words, you do have a feeling that that there is a you. It's connected to the feeling that there is a me. In other words, that there is a Bill and other people. So if there are other people, then there are other consciousnesses. And consciousness, it has not been an entity within the natural sciences which make the effort to have a complete understanding of everything. So what happens is that even though many people would deny it, the idea of consciousness, of there being such a thing as it, is really a supernatural belief. And it is indeed connected to what you were saying. You mentioned earlier the idea of spirit or something like that. So there is this unresolved problem of what are these entities floating around in the natural universe that are consciousness. And associated with that, of course, is whether those entities have any influence on what exists or not, i.e., free will versus determinism. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think that the premise and the thesis that you just presented makes a whole lot of assumptions based on just absolutely no evidence or argument of any kind. It seems what that seems to me is an argument that explains a sense of I that's culturally appropriate. Okay, there's just there's nobody can even understand if consciousness even is a thing. It's completely inappropriate for anybody to claim any kind of elaborate make any kind of elaborate conclusions about consciousness with regards to if it's spirit, if it can influence, if it cannot. I mean, let's try to answer a basic question. You know, does it even exist? So when you're talking about it not being in the natural sciences and it's associated with spirit and whether it can be, I mean, the only thing I'm interested in right now, that's all well and good to speculate those kinds of things, but to make any kind of conclusions based on something that you can't really even describe very well, because you may not be able to even experience it. The question is, can you even experience consciousness? Can it be measured? Can it be understood? Is up for debate.
You used the word conclusions, and I don't know what you're referring to.
I'm referring to the association of consciousness with the belief that it is spirit, it is something that is thereby kind of rejected or not recognized by the natural sciences and should not be recognized by the natural sciences. I'm referring to the idea that it now can refer to, you know, life after death, that is now associated with religion. I mean, it's like, you know, that is a whole inferential line of reasoning that reflects cultural beliefs and cultural norms in a certain demographic of the population, rather than any kind of rational, in my opinion, rational, reasonable exploration of the topic and what we know about it, which is virtually nothing. The topic being consciousness, and the conscious being the sense of self, and is that real?
Well, now we just switched from consciousness, which is what we were talking about, to sense of self, which is not what we were talking about.
Well, I think the consciousness question is over. I mean, I think I understand what you mean by consciousness, and let's just make sure about that. For you, consciousness is the same thing. It is subjective experience. Consciousness is a verb. It's something that happened. It is subjective experience.
Consciousness,
Was that fair?
Consciousness is not a verb.
What is it? Is it a noun for you?
Not for me. For people in general, consciousness would be a noun.
Okay, so then what I mean by consciousness is a verb is versus a noun. Subjective experience, okay, yes, it is a thing, but it is also something that happens. Subjective experience is are things that are experienced subjectively. In that way, I mean, it's a verb.
Now, by the way, as we have talked about in the past, when I use the term subjective experience,
Yes.
it's a two-word term meaning one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so a moment ago you divided it up.
I didn't mean to imply there was anything called objective experience.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but you divided it up, and
that could have confused people listening. Yes, but I acknowledged, and I agree with you. Objective experience is not, when we say subjective experience, that doesn't automatically imply there is something called objective experience in the way that's popularly understood.
Right.
Yeah, but regardless, I mean, subjective.
When you say popularly understood, I don't know what that means.
I think a lot of people that I know would say, well, when Bill and Mike say subjective experience, they are implying that there's something called objective experience, which means measurement and evidence and things that are not comprising your beliefs. That would compromise objective experience.
Yeah, and all of this, of course, is dealt with in my Mind-Body Problem book, which is available on the Humanianity.com website, free.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but what I was saying was that, subjective experience is a verb in the sense that it is something that happens. It is something that is experienced.
Well, I think that that's not a usual use of the word verb.
Okay. How would you? So the idea that I'm trying to convey is that subjective experience is something that happens. It is an action.
Well, thirst is something that happens.
So subjective experience is something that happens. The way I was using subjective experience and the way you were using it, something that happens. I was differentiating between that and who it happens to, which I called consciousness. But I'm recognizing now that's not the way that you're using the word. Subjective experience and consciousness are the same thing for you.
And I think that mine is would be much more the typical way of using the words.
So I don't kind of know about that, but so I would accept that. I can accept that if you want to. I understand that usage of that term, but the idea that I'm trying to that I'm hoping to discuss and flesh out here is what I originally meant by consciousness, which is the
sense of self.
It's the sense of self. It's I. In that it seems like subjective experience happens to something, to someone, to me. And whether that is part of subjective experience or not.
Well, it is. It's what you're experiencing.
I don't think that necessarily follows. I understand how that follows just from a use of language point of view.
It seems to me maybe that what you're saying is you want to postulate that there is an entity, namely yourself.
No, what I'm not necessarily. No, I'm not going that far. I'm even taking I'm posing a simpler question that it seems to me that things happen to me. Is that an accurate is that an accurate belief or not? Or is that sense that things happen to me simply a derivative and a function of having sensations? And if you take away those sensations, the sense of self completely disappears. I have no idea. But it's very important, I think, to understanding. It's one of the central tenets of my worldview to understand that.
Okay. Well, I do think you are indeed up against the same wall that I am and that everybody else is with regard to the mind-body problem. But another term for consciousness and subjective experience would be the way things seem. Whether I'm itching and feeling moody, feeling depressed, whether I have hunger, whether I am seeing a steering wheel in front of me, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is consciousness. And inherent in that is within my worldview and that of, I think, almost everyone, is the idea that there are things that exist, things that are going on that are not in your subjective experience or consciousness.
Okay, so
that there are other people in this world than you, other people than in this world than I,
okay,
and that
agreed.
and that
So
there are things that are going on that I will never know anything about.
okay, so you're losing me as to how I don't understand how this applies to the question at hand.
Well, uh, then I guess I've gone off track, but I I feel like it is very much well. It gets back, I think, to the assumption that you make
Don't say it,
that
please.
I am
Okay.
arriving at these beliefs about other things existing that I have no awareness of, and so on, as a logical consequence that I am deducing certain things. And that long ago, I clarified, was not so. It is a part of just a basic set of assumptions that I make that constitute my worldview. But
Right,
my worldview is not proven by something. It is not deduced from something.
right. So I still don't understand, and that could be a whole nother topic. How does that relate to what we're talking about now in terms of sense of self? I don't understand, and whether or not that is an entity unto itself that experiences subjective experience, or that it is simply a something not that, and maybe some kind of illusion.
Well, when you say sense of self, I'm assuming that it's like the sense of weight or the sense of cinnamon or the sense of you name it.
No, it's not what I mean. And that's why that is why I'm postulating
Yes,
sense of self is not part of subjective experience because they are qualitatively different. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm implying there
well,
are entities out there
it's
that
sense, though. It is
sense of
sense.
self, for lack of a better word. I mean, that this is part of the problem.
Is the sense of self sensed or not?
The sense of self is not directly sensed in the same way that the scent of cinnamon or hunger is sensed. No.
I didn't say in the same way. I was just asking whether it was sensed or not.
No, I would say it's more imagined.
Well, is that imagination something that is sensed? Is it conscious? Is it within conscious?
Yes.
So we're
But
still talking.
uh, wait a minute. Hold on. Stop. We're going off the rails here. I just want to clarify my position because I don't think you understand what I'm saying. I am not saying that the sense of self or an I is something that is not in subjective experience or not part of or not is subjective experience, and therefore it's a spirit out there floating around. All I'm asking, only question I'm posing is does subjective experience have to have an entity that is experiencing it in order to exist?
Well, that is postulating something.
So let's just start there.
Yes. And that gets into the mind body problem. I think that uh, what you're saying is that there's some kind of an entity that has consciousness or subjective experience.
What do you mean by entity? Just want to make sure we understand what you mean by that.
Most general term for uh, anything.
Some construct. So
Some
that entity could be part of subjective experience. It's just an entity.
An entity is something that you could assign a noun to.
Okay, I would agree. Okay, I understand now what you mean by an entity. Yes, that's what I would be postulating. That it is there some entity that has to be the recipient of that not has to be, but that is the recipient of subjective experience for anyone on the planet or any animal or anything. Let's just stick with humans. That's what I'm asking is that entity. Let's just start with can it be inferred as having to exist or deduced as existing?
Yeah, I think we're really close to clarifying this. I think it is normal and natural to believe that um, there are entities that have subjective experience or consciousness. Um, and that's very deeply embedded in the mind body problem because then we ask, well, what about that entity? What can we say about it? Does it exist in the universe, in the same universe that everything else exists? And if we look at the universe the way that the scientists uh, who have the greatest understanding of the universe look at it, then consciousness floats around in it, um, and most people believe that that consciousness can make things happen, can choose to do things that that they would not agree that whatever I decided to do was what I was going to do anyway, according to the laws of the universe.
I could disagree with you in your statement that the natural sciences have the best understanding of everything in the universe, but that's going to open up a can of worms. I would still say to you, once again, just because the natural sciences deduce that whatever they deduce has no bearing at all, in my opinion, on the question at hand. It's not a question for the natural sciences. Is the existence of an entity, which we can call sense of self or I, can that be inferred or necessarily deduced on the basis of subjective experience? That if you have subjective experience, there must be some entity experiencing it. That's not a question for the natural sciences. I maintain. So what they think about is important to consider, but is not the beginning and ending of the discussion, what they conclude.
Well, the natural sciences are the areas of study and thought and experimentation and so forth that enable us to have increasingly accurate beliefs. And the evidence for that increasing accuracy is the increased ability to do things that would be highly risky to do if one were not pretty sure about what was going to be the result according to mathematical equations. But those mathematical equations don't include anything having to do with consciousness.
Then, okay, this is one of my favorite subjects to debate, so I can't resist anymore. Okay. The natural sciences are the study of the physical world. Geology will be part of it. That's the definition of natural science, unless I'm not understanding you correctly. Okay, the natural sciences are the sciences that study the physical world. Astronomy, physics, geology. Those, what?
I agree.
Right, those kinds of things. Okay. There are entities in the universe that have been defined, and they might actually exist, who knows, that, and that's something we all believe exist, that have nothing to do with that shit whatsoever. Economics is not part of the natural sciences. Psychology is not part of the natural sciences. And the question at hand have to do with human behavior and human perception, not the physical world. Therefore, the natural sciences is an inappropriate subject matter expert in these areas. If you want to talk about physics, or if you want to talk about these issues in the context of the physical world, then they are the subject matter experts. However, these areas are not the physical world we're talking about. You can't appeal to an expert in another subject matter domain that has nothing to do with the domain you're talking about, or very little at best.
Well, yes, I understand that. I understand that that we humans think about the physical world and the mental world and so on. But the problem that comes about is that the mental world includes the idea of I can make something happen that would not otherwise happen. I can choose to do that. The physical scientists say that the the movement of matter and energy and anything that exists takes place according to laws that ultimately can be put into mathematical equations using variables that are things that have been measured, and that the universe, that those natural laws are not something that an entity like a god or a human or another animal could decide to make different. So whether I hand over this money to somebody else or not involves movement of my hand through space-time. And the natural sciences say that that movement is according to the laws of the universe.
Okay, that's, I would claim, is a very clear straw man argument for completely simplifying what the issue is at hand. Okay, no one is claiming, and I am not. Well, let's just say no one.
What do you mean, straw man?
It's you're simplifying the argument that I'm making with regards to the inappropriateness to use a natural sciences as a subject matter expert to answer these questions. You're simplifying my argument and claiming that well, let me finish. I'll show you how. And making claims that I'm not making in order to kind of destroy my argument. No, I am not saying that I'm not saying that the natural sciences can't apply to questions of human behavior, and because of that, I have telekinesis and I can make with my mind my dog float. That has nothing to do with my argument here. The natural sciences will describe what happens. The natural sciences will describe what happens the moment force is applied to the object of my dog.
Can you make your hand float?
I'll say it again. The natural sciences can predict what's going to happen to my hand when the electrical nerve signals, and this is biology, of course, hit my muscles, and through leverage and machine principles in physics can describe what happens to the hand. Okay, the natural sciences, before that electrical impulse is generated and hits the muscle, can't say anything about anything, and that's the area of subject. That's the subject I'm talking about. Talking about what happens before.
How is it generated? At what do you?
Good question. Good question.
Do you alter the electrical impulses in your brain?
I don't know. Yeah. But what I'm willing to do is say I don't know, which is what is so unbelievably frustrating about certain natural scientists who can claim that they can answer questions that is completely outside of their domain of expertise.
I don't think that they do. I think that what they're saying is that they are looking at these things that we can all agree upon exist, that we call matter and so on, that and in trying to understand them, we can arrive at models or sets of mathematical equations that allow one to predict very accurately what will happen if the situation is currently a particular way as opposed to some other way.
I understand. And I'm very passionate about this subject, in fact, because I believe that a lot of the reasons why really important, good science that really matters, in my belief, about like the well-being of humanity is ignored by people is because of the tendency for certain natural scientists to make insane claims that almost in a certain sense position themselves as having some kind of omniscient or omnipotent understanding of everything that happens in the world based on equations or that haven't even been developed yet, but on their belief that these equations could be developed. It is a reason why, in part, I think climate change is not really believed in by a lot of people. It's the reason why anti-vaxxers exist. These scientists who have a reductionist view and push their ideas that they know why people are doing everything on the planet is absurd on its face. It's absurd on its merits, and it's insulting, and it's untrue. They keep pushing these ideas, and what winds up happening is that people reject science. It's not science that is the problem here. It's these scientists and natural scientists who have this reductionist view of the world. And it seemed like an ego trip to me. They just want to claim that they have some kind of insight into the way everything works in the universe based on their belief that equations can solve everything. That's absurd. And it's even absurd with regards to domains within their own subject field. For quantum physics is one, chaos theory is another. There are ideas in the natural sciences that other natural scientists have that completely reject the idea of a reductionist universe. And that it part of the fabric of the universe is you cannot measure everything, period. It hasn't been proved yet, but that's a competing claim to this reductionist view. But what we are talking about here is not in the natural sciences, and it can't be answered. Go ahead.
Okay, but that portrayal of scientists and the scientific point of view and so forth, I think is not accurate. When you say that scientists think that everything can be predicted, no, they don't believe that.
Hold on. I said certain natural scientists believe that. You're absolutely right. Others do not. But there are absolutely scientists who are described as reductionist who believe that if they could only measure everything in the universe and discover the equations that govern those measurements, they can predict everything that happens. That is, they do exist, and they're very vocal. Which is really what you're saying. I mean, that's what I'm hearing your argument to be here.
In the word reductionist, and that has all sorts of connotations and ambiguous meanings and so forth in my mind. But
should I explain what I mean by reductionist? No, not necessary.
Well, I was going to.
Okay.
I think avoiding the term would be better because it just introduces more ambiguity and everything.
Okay.
But what scientists have been doing has been taking the world as you and I experience it and attempting to understand how it works. And it leads them indeed to say that the way things look or seem is not at all the way things actually are according to the evidence. And the evidence is the ability to predict based upon some model, including mathematical models, which are for the purpose of prediction. So, you look at the wall, and what you see is not what the natural scientists would say is actually in existence, that it's mostly empty space, and that there are certain particles, particle-like entities and wave-like entities that interact in certain ways, and that the accuracy of that can be shown by experiments that make for predictions that allow one to make predictions that come true with a high degree of certainty. Now, what people seem to be saying is, well, yeah, well, that's just the physical world.
Okay.
But that's not like the mental world.
Okay.
Well, wait.
I just disagree very strongly. Go ahead.
Mention.
You don't have to stop. I just went like this.
Well, no, you gave two fingers.
I know. I changed it. It's just one. It's just one finger.
So it's about gone now. So the problem is that people believe that there are other things than what the scientists are talking about, one of which is an entity, which, to oversimplify, would be an entity inside your head that was changing the nerve impulses, not according to the laws of science, but according to what it decided it wanted to do. And then that would make the arm and the hand do certain things. So there's that connection between something that is willing, something that is is deciding to do something, and the physical world that the scientists are talking about. That connection between those two things is nowhere to be found. It is much speculated on, but it is quite natural for us to believe that there are entities that indeed have free will and can choose to do things.
Okay. So now let me have my rebuttal. Okay. That's not what scientists are doing. Okay. See, I would agree. Well, let me say this. They're doing a lot more than what you just said. And I think you are doing a lot more in making certain claims about the metaphysical world. Okay. I agree. Scientists are measuring and discovering equations that can make predictions about the physical world. Okay. What I'm objecting to, in very, very strong terms, are a couple of things. Okay. First claim that I have is those equations are inappropriately applied to the metaphysical world. Firstly, to say that right off the bat, force equals mc squared has nothing, cannot, or any other description of the physical world applies to that physical world. In certain circumstances, by the Newton laws don't apply in a black hole, for example. They do, but they're not very specific. Okay, so these equations don't apply to the metaphysical world like economics or like psychology. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is
metaphysical, just note.
Yeah, metaphysical world, non-physical world, like psychology, like human behavior, like economics. Believe it or not, there's something else besides the physical world that we recognize as humans. I mean, it's the core of this that is so infuriating to me is the arrogance that, and this is what which is what I really find so offensive. The idea that what's even worse of what's happening is that the natural scientists, I think you're claiming, and I agree with you, I think a lot of them do, and I think what you're doing here is claiming that the way we understand and predict and can measure the physical world applies to every other domain simply because that methodology works to getting us to the moon. So, I mean, geez, we can use equations to go to the moon. So I guess that means we can predict the way the stock market is going to be if we just could measure everybody on the planet and could have the equations that would be able to predict with the stock accurately how the stock market worked. That's ridiculous.
That's not a representation of the way I think.
Boy, that sure did sound like it was.
I know, and I think it's because
Then maybe I misunderstood.
I think it's because you have a strong emotional reaction to a
Perhaps
view that you see as being present when it is not.
Well, then let me make sure I understand what you're saying there. I heard you say that the natural to I guess to summarize, the natural metaphysical things like the sense of self or consciousness is not part of the natural sciences. And the fact that we continue to believe that consciousness or these metaphysical ideas exist and they're actual things, even though they're not in the natural sciences, has to do with psychological needs we might have, preferences we have, biases that we have. But in reality, because it's not in the natural sciences, it doesn't exist. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that not accurate?
No.
Okay, then I apologize. Then I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's what I heard you say.
I know. It's interesting, though, that, as you talk, I get increasingly lost with words that are thrown in that certainly are entirely consistent within your mind and fit together and are convincing and so forth, but they don't do that for me. But that's I'm trying to think how I can make it clearer. See, what I'm saying is that there are unresolved issues,
Right.
that we are faced with, all under the heading of mind-body problem and free will versus determinism.
Hmm.
That an effort to have one understanding that fits together, that includes what you're calling the physical and the metaphysical, that has not been possible.
Well, it hasn't been done yet. Doesn't mean it's not possible. I mean, that would be unbelievably amazing if the natural sciences can somehow give us some kind of clarity on just exactly, how sense of self arises and why we believe it that way. That would be the best thing ever. I mean, that would clarify a lot of things.
Well,
but what I'm saying is they haven't done that yet.
The same would apply to the existence of God. Well,
sure.
Scientists have not come up with it yet, but give them time and they'll be able to prove the existence of God.
Or not, or that it's unbelievably improbable. There's a famous example that a lot of these people like to say, the teacups. I think it's the teapots around Jupiter, and the argument is it stems from a debate a theist and a non-theist had with regards to something. I've heard a lot of friends in our circles use the same argument, and the idea goes, well, I haven't observed teapots, just because I can't see, like, you know, something along like that, just because I can't see teapots going around the moon, going around Jupiter, you know, obviously everybody knows teapots aren't circling Jupiter. You know, it's not something I have to observe. That's something I have to prove. I don't have to prove that there are not teapots circling around Jupiter in order to say there's a very, very high likelihood that teapots are not circulating around Jupiter. Okay, but I think with these, do you understand that argument that they're talking about? Okay, but you know, what these people fail to acknowledge is that I know a whole shitload about teapots, orbital mechanics. I know what it takes to get to Jupiter. I know how to make a teapot. What they're not recognizing is they have no ability to explain at all these metaphysical ideas. So you know, it is completely unreasonable for them to make any claims about it. And they make this mistake, these people who I would claim to be reductionist, or people, I think you describe them to be, I forgot the word that you used. They make this mistake constantly. It's almost as if reason doesn't apply. Reason doesn't have to apply to the natural sciences. It's like they work by their own set of rules. That's just evidence and probability. It's bizarre.
I could not understand your portrayal of me and so on.
I don't mean to. You may not be. I was talking about the people who are arguing that I don't have to disprove the existence of consciousness on the basis that, given what we know about consciousness and the physical universe, it's very, very unlikely that it actually exists. Well, that is an unreasonable position because they know nothing about zero. It's not like they know a little bit. They know nothing. That argument about the teapots around Jupiter does not apply because we know a lot about teapots. We know a lot about Jupiter. When the natural sciences can start making claims and start proving with evidence that they know something about consciousness, then they could start making claims about it in some kind of credible way. But until then, I wish they would keep their mouths closed, because they are doing a disservice to science and they are causing people to reject science out of hand. They're causing people to reject valid claims that scientists make about things they actually know about, like climate change and vaccines.
I don't know whom you're referring to.
Well, I certainly can speak to people within our circle of friends or acquaintances that have made those claims. I could think of 4 or 5 of them right off the bat. But with regards to scientists, I've seen documentaries where there are many. I've heard philosophers make the same argument. They're called reductionists.
What would be an example of a claim?
An example of the claim would be the physical universe is based on a set of equations, and on the basis of that, we can predict certain things in this universe pretty well. We can predict how, you know, the orbit of the planets will go and motions of the stars and whatnot. How a ship will float across the ocean, how planes fly. So it stands to reason that if we could, on the basis of that, if we could just develop a set of equations to describe everything and measure everything in enough detail, I would be able to predict everything that would happen in the universe between now and the end of time. I've heard natural scientists say that, and I've read natural scientists, you know, make that claim. That's an example of a claim that is completely inappropriate because In fact, you know the equivalent of 0 about how the universe works on that scale. In the same way, you know 0 about consciousness. It just comes with a simple argument. Don't make claims about stuff you know nothing about. Have the, in my opinion, the maturity to say, I can't comment about that because I have no idea. You know, I hear doctors say that all the time about life after death. They say, you know what, that's not my domain. I have no idea. Have the balls to say that. And it's frustrating that they don't, because it causes damage, in my opinion. So that's an example of a claim. Just one. I could think of others.
Well, see, there's so much that that we could stop and look more closely at in what you're saying. That could we go back and just describe the claim as simply as possible?
The claim is, do not, I guess my claim is, you should not make claims. No one should make claims they know nothing about. No one should make claims about things which they know nothing about.
What we're talking about.
Oh.
You said that certain people make certain claims. I wanted to hear one of those claims.
I just gave you one of those claims. That's one claim. One claim is that the entire universe works according to a set of equations and rules and measurements. If we could discover those rules in enough detail, and we could measure accurately enough, we could predict everything that happens between now and the end of the universe and the end of time. Okay. That's a claim.
Okay. Now, does that claim include the idea that we will be able to do that one day?
Correct. Okay. Yes.
I don't know of anybody who would make that claim.
Oh, you mean that it'll actually happen? Have I ever heard anybody say? No, I've never heard anybody say that'll actually happen. However, I think these people use the same method, they use the same thinking to make, I would say, subordinate claims. One of which is that the mind does not really exist. It's a figment of our imagination. And the way that we know that is because we have basically, the argument is, we have no evidence that it does exist. We only have evidence that the brain exists, and we can poke at the brain, and we get reports from people that what they call the mind changes. Well, on that basis, then the brain is really the structure or the entity that exists. And this idea of mind is a complete fantasy. That's another claim that uses the same kind of reasoning that is more substantial and specific. And there are others. Do you want me to go ahead?
We've introduced another term here, mind. And in my mind, that's the same as subjective experience or consciousness. However, what I would point out is that, again, the mind has never been observed. We can't observe anything unless we can observe that which is not that thing.
I don't understand that. Can you repeat that?
Yes. We cannot observe anything if we cannot observe that which is not that thing. In other words, the
I think
bound.
I understand. I think I got it. So you need you need a point of view, a
No,
reference point,
no.
not that thing.
I can give you an example, and I've done this in the past.
Okay.
You can take one part of your subjective experience or consciousness or mind, namely the visual field, and you can actually say, because we have two eyes, close one eye, so we only have one eye, and it has a quote visual field. That visual field is never observed. We tend to think, oh, yes, we can observe it. It's a circular disc. But we can show that that's not true, that one cannot observe that circular disc. We can show that by holding, if one is closing one's left eye and keeping the right eye open, and then extending the right arm forward and bending the hand up so that one is looking at the back of one's hand, and then one looks at one's thumbnail, one cannot see one's little finger if the hand is adjusted in the right way. But you cannot see that you cannot see your little finger. You just can't see your little finger. You don't see that that circular disc is really a donut-shaped entity that has a hole in it. You can't see the hole, and you can't see the outer boundary. You
Okay.
can not see anything that is not that visual field, so you can't see the visual field.
Okay. So I think I have a response to that. Look, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with your, I think, your point. However, because your point is being made, I feel as part of a larger argument with regards to what I would claim to be the limitations of the natural sciences. I'm going to strongly refute what you just said along a certain argument. Okay, so what you're doing.
What did I say that you're going to refute?
The idea that our vision, what I think you're kind of the summary of what I hear you saying is that you can't really see what your true, what your real, what the most accurate vision you have is, which is that there is a gap in your visual field that you can't be aware of. Okay, and
you can become aware of it, but you can't see it.
Right, you kind of can't see it. And like I said, if this was any other context, I'd be agreeing with you, and I agree with your point. However, I think, again, because this is being used to support some inappropriate claims about the domain of the natural sciences, I'm going to refute it. What you're doing here is creating a special situation to show people that their vision is something different than what it commonly is when their eyes are open. That doesn't change what it is when their eyes are open. When their eyes are open, that's their vision.
I don't follow that at all. That's not, it's like you've missed completely.
Let me try to say it a different way.
Well, wait, can you tell me what I was demonstrating?
I think you're demonstrating that there is a gap in our visual field that you cannot see. You can deduce it based on creating certain situations, like closing one eye and holding your hand up and putting your hand out there. Right? I mean, I think that's what
was the purpose? What was the general proposition that I was presenting?
The general proposition is that you can show that there are well, it's a couple of things. I think the general proposition is that there are things we take for granted that we assume are true, that upon closer inspection and upon experimentation is actually not the case. And through that, you're trying to substantiate your premise here, that you can't observe anything if you can't observe that which is not that thing. I think is exactly kind of what you had said. And the idea behind that,
I can barely make out.
I wrote it down. You said we cannot observe things if we can't observe that. If we can't observe something, if we can't observe that which is not that something.
Okay. Yes.
So you can't see that gap in your visual field unless you can observe and set up your vision in a certain way, so that you can see that the gap indeed is there. I think that's what you're arguing. And I would agree with you, like I said.
Not exactly that. I can't tell whether that's, again, I'm just saying we can't observe something if we can't observe that which is not that something.
Okay.
And that has to do with the mind. We cannot observe the mind. No one has ever observed the mind. So it is a hypothetical construct, or an imaginary container of what you and I are agreeing is subjective experience or consciousness.
There's a problem with that, though, and I've heard that argument before. Okay, so I would claim, and I'm curious to hear your response to this and your refute, if you have one. Okay, so your feelings have never been observed. Thoughts have never been observed. Vision has never been observed. No part of subjective experience has ever been observed. That's why it's subjective experience. That's part of what it means. So does that mean these ideas are fantastical?
That's not correct.
Go ahead.
You are observing your feelings. You are observing your thoughts.
Oh, that's what you meant by observation. So my ability to observe.
Yeah.
Okay. An individual, not the ability to be kind of observed by another.
And you have no ability to observe your mind, even though you have words to apply to an entity that you consider to exist.
So yes, I would agree. The mind is a defined construct that, in a sense, consists of what we would call subjective experience. What people, in my opinion, When people use the mind as a label to refer to their thoughts, their motivational states, their feelings, their sense of hunger and whatnot, they call all that the mind. I would say, what's the point? So what? Yes, they're using a label to denote the sum total of subjective experience, just as you would use the word consciousness to denote that sum total. They're using the word mind.
Mm-hmm.
What's the point? If
Well,
we're talking about natural sciences, okay, the natural sciences can't measure and observe feelings, motivational states, vision in the same way it can't observe the mind. Does that mean those things don't exist?
well, what we're talking about now is the mind-body problem, and I'm not saying that we humans have solved the mind-body problem.
Okay.
It is still there as something we have to live with. But it's like you see a brick that is on the ground, and then the brick moves to another place. Okay, now the natural scientist says that that has to be according to the laws of the universe. So something has to be exerting force on the brick. And so we can say, well, a human picked up the brick and put it somewhere else. Okay. So indeed, the movement of the human um, is according to the laws of the natural universe. Well, then we can take a look at the human and say its body is making certain movements. And indeed, that's related to the electrical impulses in the brain and going out the nervous system to the muscles and so forth. And all of that can be explained by the natural sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But somewhere in there, we postulate that there is another entity not described in the natural sciences that can cause those electrical impulses to be that way as opposed to some different way. And so that entity is not operating according to the laws of the natural sciences, but instead is making decisions which ultimately lead to the movement of that brick. Well, the natural scientist says, well, we don't see any evidence that there is something that alters the laws of the universe, such as to make that happen when it would not have happened otherwise.
Can you say that again? I don't understand. You got to stop. It would not have happened otherwise.
What I was saying was that that brick moved. It had to be moved, presumably, by something that exerted force on it.
Okay.
That a human did it. Okay, the human body then interacted with the brick such that the brick moved. Okay, well, we've got the human body. It is behaving according to the natural sciences, according to electrical impulses emanating from the brain, going to the musculature. Okay, we're still within the natural sciences.
Okay.
But somewhere we introduce something outside of that system, an entity that can decide to make the brain cause the body to move the brick or not move the brick, can make a choice.
Okay.
And that choice would imply then that the brick's movement would not be according to the laws of the natural sciences, but would have to include the choice that this entity, the
Holy.
self,
Okay, I think I got it.
or God, or somebody did. So the
Let me
idea,
re I think I got it. I think I understand. Go ahead.
the idea of choice or free will is something that comes in and disturbs the internal consistency of the natural sciences.
So okay, granted. Are you making any conclusions based on that proposal? Like, are you saying, I think I hear you're saying, but I don't think you actually are. So I want to check in with you on this, Bill. Are you saying that because the natural sciences, are you saying that because the mind or God, that the natural sciences have no equations to describe, are that on that basis they can't exist because the natural sciences don't have the equations to describe it? Is that what?
No,
No. Okay. Okay.
I'm simply trying to make as clear as possible the mind-body problem and free will versus determinism problem.
Okay.
Why it remains a problem.
Right. So I think that's a very important point. I agree with you. The mind-body problem has not been solved. However, because it's not been solved, it is completely appropriate to make any kind of claim about within the domain of which it's not been solved. And it is completely inappropriate to make a claim that supports, a certain outcome. So, for example, I agree the mind-body problem has not been solved. Okay, if that's the case, then don't argue. Things should not be argued as if it was solved, and moreover, should not be argued as if it's been solved in favor of the body. It hasn't been solved yet. It's just as valid to claim the mind exists, that solution favors the mind proposition, as it is to argue that it favors the body. What is so frustrating is when I hear natural scientists, or really atheists is really, I think, a lot of where it comes from too, in our circle of friends, arguing as if the mind-body problem has been solved in favor of the body. Well, it hasn't.
Well, actually, the mind-body problem has been solved in my book.
I agree. You have an interesting perspective on it.
The
Yes.
solution, the solution is that it is not true that there is free will. It is not true that there is that things are determined. That one can have either perspective, and and that's a part of the larger problem about the mind-body problem.
Right.
Uh,
So
you,
in the
you,
con oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done. Go ahead.
you, you were you were kind of coming to the conclusion that I came to in the mind-body problem book about free will and determinism.
Right. And I think just practically, I propose what that means is that if something is not in the natural sciences, and not recognized as existing in the natural sciences, i.e., it's metaphysical, that is a reasonable, very appropriate argument to make. And you can't say something like, well, that's not recognized by the natural sciences, therefore it's kind of inappropriate for you to be arguing from that position. The mind-body problem has not been solved yet, and it is appropriate to take either position, and valid and reasonable. That's my claim. What do you think?
Well, it goes a little bit further than that, my position.
Mm-hmm.
We have the other sciences, and our sciences are the epitome of our rationality. And rationality consists of the rules of logic and the rules of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So we can take something like economics and develop the laws by which economics seems to operate. And if those laws are accurate, then we can predict what's going to happen. So the whole idea, the important idea, is the ability to be able to predict, and that is what is meant by accurate beliefs. So we're talking about beliefs about the quote natural world, and also beliefs about economics, and beliefs about anything, and whether those beliefs are accurate or not. And whether they're accurate or not means whether or not they allow one to predict what is going to happen, or what is going to happen if one does this, that, or the other.
Okay. I don't agree with the idea that if you have accurate enough equations and accurate enough measurements, you can predict how the stock market will behave. And that's because the stock market is an inherently chaotic entity, and that it's like built into the fabric. It's like it has to do with entropy. You cannot measure certain things. It's not possible. And moreover, there are certain equations that, I'm not a mathematician, but I've heard mathematicians talk like this, that you can't solve. The idea that you can reduce most things, if not everything, to a set of equations and measurements in such a way that you can make accurate predictions stems from, I claim, our experiences with the natural sciences in very, very narrow domains, such as going to the moon, biology, whatnot. Okay, just because it works in those domains doesn't mean it is universally applicable. Not only will I claim it's not, I would claim there's actually evidence to show it's not within quantum mechanics and certain branches of mathematics.
I don't think that that's true.
Well, you know, which part is not true?
The last thing that you said, I can't grasp.
That there are branches within the natural sciences that point to the fact that you cannot measure accurately everything, and you cannot have equations that ascribe everything.
Yeah, but you actually can, but those equations may reflect that what you are measuring behaves according to probability rules, and that if you measure something over and over, you will get a highly predictable curve of outcomes.
Yeah.
So,
That's not true in certain branches of mathematics and certain things that branch studies. There are situations and experiments that have been run for thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of times, and the outcome has no pattern. It's completely random. It branches of nonlinear equations, chaos, a branch of mathematics called chaos theory. And the only thing in quantum physics that comes to mind is the uncertainty principle, but that I'm not as familiar with. Not to say I'm familiar with that branch of mathematics. I can't solve any of the equations. I'm speaking as a layman here.
but what you described, the lack of predictability would be a probabilistic curve, maybe a flat one. Uh, but the uh, but so that would be something on the basis of which you can make predictions uh, that have to do with increasing the probability that you will predict the right outcome.
No, what those experiments and equations show is that you can do nothing to increase the chances of predicting the outcome. It's not possible. It's not that we don't have the equipment to measure it accurately enough. It's not that we can't gather enough data. It's that built into the structure of the universe, how it works, is that there are certain things that are inherently chaotic and completely random.
Okay, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying that completely random
Mhm.
is a probabilistic curve uh, that may be flat, for instance. In other words, that
Right.
no particular uh, outcome is more likely to occur than some other outcome. And so that
Yes.
would be one
Right.
of the laws of the universe then.
Um, your state reminds me of an economic idea called negative growth. It's like they don't want to acknowledge the idea of a recession, so they call it negative growth. It's like in my opinion, embedded within your statement is the complete unwillingness to acknowledge that there are things that you can never predict, you can never measure. And instead of just saying that, what you're saying is, well, we can measure it, but the outcome is that we'll never be able to measure it. Well, okay, granted. Yes, the outcome will be a flat probability curve, but the practical outcome of that is it is impossible to measure and predict anything within that domain.
You're portraying me as making some statement different than what I'm making. um,
Okay.
if something is completely unpredictable, then that's something that one would need to base one's decisions on, recognizing that that particular thing was unpredictable.
Okay.
Uh, uh,
Right.
Example of not doing that would be assuming that indeed it was predictable because it had been a certain way several times in a row. In other words, superstition. Um, but so what I'm saying is that uh, if one believes that there is some relationship and that such that one would predict such and such happening, when that belief is not correct, then that would be an example of an inaccurate belief. And so the recognition that something is completely unpredictable or unpredictable currently, um, that could change in the future, or as you point out, maybe it has been shown that there are examples where it can be demonstrated that the probability distribution curve is flat.
But when the probability distribution curve is flat, Of course, I mean, that's an important piece of information, the fact that you can't predict and you can't measure the outcome in any kind of accurate way. That's a valid piece of information, but within the context of what we're talking about here, I think the salient point is you can't predict certain things. It's part embedded in the universe. It's not possible. You cannot get the equations. You cannot get measurements accurate enough. It's impossible. Okay, that is a very important acknowledgement that there is a limitation to the idea that equations and measurements can be discovered such that we can predict everything from how to go to the moon to whether or not God exists, to whether consciousness exists, to how the stock market is going to behave. It speaks to the idea. Go ahead.
That portrayal of these individuals who are making such claims, I don't think is an accurate claim. Certainly, it is not a portrayal of my beliefs.
Well, I had gotten the impression that it was because of a lot of the times when I would, not a lot of the times, but sometimes, when I would bring up a certain idea like consciousness or mind, you would say something like, well, that idea is not in the natural sciences. That's metaphysical. And like, the impression I get for the reasons why you made that point was to, I guess, to fill in the blanks, it would be, those ideas are not in the natural sciences. It's therefore inappropriate to believe they exist, or to argue from a point of view that they might exist. Maybe I misunderstood your point in doing that.
Not my position.
Okay, so then I don't say, because do you recall saying, well, that doesn't exist in the natural sciences when I say certain things? So I'm wondering, what do you mean by that? I mean, what's relevant there? So what that it doesn't exist in the natural sciences? Why does that matter for what we're talking about?
Well, I guess it depends on what we're talking about. And I can't reconstruct that for any particular point in time in our discussion. But I believe that it is an important fact to realize that the belief that the mind exists is a supernatural belief.
Why is that important?
Oh, many people would say they have no supernatural beliefs. And I would say that we have all sorts of supernatural beliefs.
Okay. So that's the only reason why you're making that point, that it's not in the natural sciences? Because I would definitely claim I have supernatural beliefs. I think everybody does.
Right. Okay, you and I do agree on that.
Oh, sure. I got the impression that the reason why you were making that statement is because I was arguing from an inappropriate premise, because those ideas don't exist in the natural sciences. So I guess that's not what you're saying.
I was not taking a position like that.
Okay. So when you talk about, because I've also heard you talk about in this discussion, the idea that the way the natural sciences work is, in fact, when I've refuted you, I've said, well, so what that it's not in the natural sciences? And you had said, well, the idea here is that natural sciences work by making predictions. And when those predictions are accurate, it means our beliefs are accurate. So to me, what you were saying then is, if the natural sciences can't make a prediction about something you believe, that belief is inappropriate, i.e., these supernatural beliefs that I have regarding the mind or consciousness. But that seems to be not what you're saying.
No, I'm saying there is a contradiction between our supernatural beliefs and our natural beliefs. I wonder if you could excuse me for a second.
Sure, sure.
Okay, I'll be back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay. So I think I guess I'm understanding a little bit more now how I think. But it still did seem to me that you were arguing the premise that if these things, if something is not, it seemed that the premise was the natural sciences work by making predictions, and if those predictions are accurate, our beliefs are confirmed. Therefore, for you to believe something that's not in the natural sciences means that you cannot make any predictions about it, and you can't validate whether your belief is true or not.
No, that's totally wrong.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Because there are other sciences than the natural sciences. But the sciences are the application, the extreme development of the rules of logic and the rules of evidence. And the purpose of them is to obtain accurate beliefs, as accurate as possible. And now, we get nowhere close to being able to predict everything that takes place and so forth. What I'm also saying is that the way that people normally think has a problem in it, or a set of problems, the mind-body problem and free will versus determinism, that they are often unaware of. And so I try to address those in my book, um, which I believe you have read.
I read it twice. I
Right.
read it once, 3 times. Once on my own. I read it twice with you, which I still say was very. We gotta find time to do that. I want to find time to go through the book and hopefully record it while we're doing it. Because if you recall, I was asking you questions about the book, and you were expanding on the ideas and explaining why and how it worked. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do for these videos, for people to understand the book better.
Well, maybe so. The only problem is that that would involve the viewer sitting for a long period of time, not hearing or seeing anything going on. That being time when you were reading to yourself the book, and then asking questions. I suppose if you read the book sentence by sentence out loud, and then immediately talked about your thoughts about it, maybe that would work.
Maybe that would work. That's another way of doing it. That's an important thing I think we should get to, because a lot of the people, our mutual acquaintances that have read the book Mind Body Problem, I know they found it hard to follow, and they disagree with a lot of subjects. There's a lot of contents about it, and I think it would be more accessible, a video reading it with you and having me ask questions about it, challenging certain ideas and you defending it, would be beneficial to people to get the ideas through in the book. We've got to find time to do that soon, or rather than later.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So on that, what were you going to say?
Well, I'm sorry I interrupted. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, I don't know what time you have to go. I got to be out of here by 6:30.
Yeah, well, The earlier I finish, the better.
The better.
Yeah.
I think I felt we were a little all over the map today. But I also think that the end of the discussion clarified for me a very important worldview I thought you had, which I'm now understanding you don't. So when I hear you say to me, well, that's not in the natural sciences, I shouldn't interpret that to mean, well, that's not an appropriate belief to have.
Right.
Okay, that's very important, and I think we are in agreement with regards to that. It is we all have supernatural beliefs, and what I also say it could be appropriate to have supernatural beliefs.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're certainly in agreement too. Do you want to continue talk about? I'm sorry.
Also, there was what most of this discussion was about, especially early, and that had to do with consciousness and subjective experience and the mind.
Yeah. You want to continue that next time?
Are we in agreement?
I think it has yet to be determined whether we're in agreement. So maybe we should talk about it. I think we're in agreement. I can agree to use the word consciousness to reflect consciousness and subjective experience are the same thing. What we talked about after that was this idea of the sense of self and I.
Right.
And that got into, well, that's not in the natural sciences, and it got us on a tangent. Maybe we should continue to talk about sense of self and the idea of I next time. What is that? Is that part of subjective experience?
Yeah, well, now, for me, it's obvious that's a part of subjective experience. The sense of self, the sense of anything.
Sense of self, I would agree. It must be part of subjective experience.
Okay. We're in agreement.
That I would say we're in agreement about. But that doesn't mean, I guess that doesn't address the salient point that I think is necessary and very important to examining our worldviews, and that is whether or not subjective experience requires an entity to be experiencing it or not.
And what I would say is that it is normal and natural for us to have such a concept or a belief. And those people who do not believe in well, let's see, what would it be? In other words, things having to do with the spirit, or in other words, entities in the universe that float around and have an impact and so on, and that there's more than just oneself, a solipsistic point of view, that there's you and me and lots of other people and so on, that that there is that it's normal and natural to have those supernatural beliefs and that they're a part of life. I'm not sure exactly what point is crucial here between you and me.
Well, I think that I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to the idea that the necessity for an entity to exist that experiences subjective experience implies necessarily the idea of spirit. I think that's a bridge too far for me.
Well,
And
that's to do with what this entity is called. You can call it different things. You can call it soul. You can call it, whatever.
Yeah, but what I mean by that is I don't think you can apply the attributes that is commonly, I claim, assigned to a soul, such as the ability for it to exist after death, for it to go to some other existence in heaven or hell, or for it to be able to float outside of the body and look down on yourself. That's where those questions are maybe, down the road. Right now, I think is it possible to have subjective experience without some I or some sense of self who's experiencing it? And that's the only question I have.
Yeah.
Whether I wouldn't call it a soul, personally.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you want to start that next time?
Okay, we can. Mm-hmm.
All right. I felt that we communicated very well today.
Yes.
You agree?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Good.
So this is it, I guess.
All right. Have a good one, Bill.
You too. Take care.
I'll see you later. Bye.
Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better we can be.